Okay, everyone, you're all very welcome here in Clyde Road tonight. Thanks for coming along. And for those webcasting, you're very welcome. Just very quickly, if we can switch our phones to silent, that'd be fantastic. We have two emergency exits. We've one at the side and one at the back where we all came in. For those attending for the first time, the Energy Environment Division hosts a series of lectures, breakfast briefings, seminars throughout the year between October and May, dealing with topics of energy and the environmental effects of energy production and usage. So you can have a look on Engineers Ireland, the events page, and keep an eye out for future events. We typically run at least one event per month, so keep an eye out for that. Tonight we're very privileged and honoured to have Laura and David speaking around Irish public transport policy and the BusConnects Project. We've Laura Behan, who is Head of Climate Change Unit at the Department of Transport, and David King, who is Head of Public Transport Investment in the National Transport Authority. So the two guys are going to go through their very topical and interesting presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Laura, I'll hand it over to yourself. Thanks, guys.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Laura Behan. As John pointed out, I'm Head of the Climate Change Unit in the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport. I have just a very, very brief presentation to give you this evening on developing Irish transport and climate policy, and in particular the role of public transport. I know I'm very much the warm-up act for the main event this evening, which is Dave, because I'm sure you're all dying to hear about the innovative new approach to delivering urban bus transport that will be BusConnects. So I am really just hoping to frame tonight's discussion in the context of climate change policy and the challenge that we are presented with in terms of meeting our climate change transport, and particularly the decarbonisation of transport over the next 30 years or so, and how we might be getting that on the road. Just in terms of I said I have a very brief presentation, so I will fly through it. It's very much a snapshot of a few key characteristics of Irish transport that are key to the development of climate policy on the passenger side and on the freight side. A little bit about climate emissions, our targets, our recent trends, how Irish transport emissions stack up and how they stack up against our EU counterparts, and then how all that relates into making policy choices about taking that forward. So the first thing, we'll just to briefly go through passenger transport. So I suppose we often focus in transport policy on journeys to work and journeys to school, because that's probably when the constraints arise most, given that the timings of when they occur. But I think it's probably really important for people to realise that people travel for a huge variety of purposes, and that work and education are even not the majority of those. Now, it's probably important to point out in relation to this slide that the companion journeys here are probably education journeys, because this is only adult journeys that are measured in the National Travel Survey. So, but still in all, work at 30% and education at probably about 19%. There are still an awful lot of other reasons why people travel in Ireland, and all of those journeys have to be decarbonised, not just the key journeys to work and school. So how do we travel? Nobody's going to be surprised when I tell you that 74% of journeys in Ireland are undertaken by car. What does surprise people sometimes, because we hear how badly Ireland is performing all the time, is how we stack up against the EU average and other key countries. So, for example, you can see in the chart across there, we're actually, in terms of car mode share, we're not doing too badly. In fact, we're less than the EU average. What is probably most surprising about that particular chart is the extent to which we travel by bus as opposed to train. You'll see in most other EU countries the train has a much higher mode share, but for Ireland the predominant mode of public transport is bus. So just, as I said, these are just a few brief snapshots of the Irish transport sector before we move into the main emissions piece. But this is quite an important aspect for people to realise when we're talking about emissions in Ireland. In terms of the percentage of vehicles on the road, Heavy goods vehicles and light goods vehicles only amount to 13% of total number of vehicles on the road, but they amount to 33% or 31% of energy use, and a slightly less amount of emissions. So they are very, very significant contributors to our climate challenge. As you can see, public passenger transport there only accounts for 5% of energy consumption in transport. So now just a brief recap on our greenhouse gas emissions targets. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the challenge that faces us, but the key dates to note are 1990, which is the year in which the UN benchmark is set against. For EU purposes, though, in terms of meeting our effort-sharing targets under EU requirements, 2005 is the key year. So by 2020, Ireland has committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to 20% below 2005 levels. 2030 negotiations are still ongoing. Parliament is still considering them, but the headline target for Ireland at the moment is that by 2030 we would have cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% off the 2005 base. And then our national climate ambition, of course, is that by 2050 we'll have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% compared to 1990 levels, which will require a reduction of at least 80% across electricity generation, built environment and the transport sectors, essentially decarbonising transport. So just the most recent emissions data published by the EPA set out how Ireland's emissions have increased in line with economic growth from 1990, peaking in 2001. 2005, as I said, is the key year for EU emissions targets. So as you can see, in 2005, our emissions were quite high. We have to reduce our overall non-ETS emissions by 20% off that 2005 base. You can see all sectors are represented there. It's difficult to see how they break down in that chart. So this one sets out the emissions profile of the various different sectors a little bit more clearly. Despite the distraction tactics and diversion tactics often employed by the agriculture sector, where you would often believe that transport is the largest sector in terms of emissions, I'm afraid transport's only the third largest sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland. Third to agriculture first and energy industries second. Now, it is both, all of those sectors are growing. All of those sectors grew last year, unfortunately. Our emissions trends are heading in the wrong direction. But since 2005, transport emissions have actually reduced. Now, just how that stacks up against the EU, our EU colleagues, we have a chart here setting out how the various different sectors are performing in an EU context. And as you can see, our EU counterparts are finding transport the most difficult sector to tackle. The transport emissions are the ones that are increasing substantially, and although they have reduced, they're certainly not reducing at the same pace as the other sectors. We are unusual in our emissions profile in that agriculture is considerably larger in Ireland than it is in the EU average. It's only 12%, so that does make our emissions, our challenge, that little bit more difficult. Right, now transport. Our transport greenhouse gas emissions profile is set out here. You'll see this particular trend across the next few graphs, and the picture is quite stark. As we can see, since 1990, transport emissions growth has been really, really significant, in line with growth in the number of passenger cars, in particular, economic growth, employment growth, and it's a trend that has happened across the world in line with economic growth. As you can see, we were reasonably successful at reducing emissions in transport between 2007 and 2012, although unfortunately we're back on an upward curve, which we do have to address at this stage. This, as you can see, the profile is replicated here, but this graph is just a little bit useful in terms of identifying how our fuel use has changed over that time period. Diesel is the pink, and petrol is the blue. So I think it's very striking the extent to which diesel, which had been predominantly the fuel of business and particularly rural areas where distances were longer, has now translated into a much more widespread use, peaked again in 2007, and we are only now beginning to see a reduction in purchasing of diesel vehicles and the use of diesel, although it has proved more energy efficient and has contributed to some emissions reductions for us, has a number of other concerns, particularly around air quality. But the graph is quite stark in terms of the growth of diesel as a fuel in Ireland. The green is interesting. If you see the light green just at the very, very top of the graph, you can see the introduction of renewables into our fuel mix, which is becoming more and more significant. It's small at the moment, but we hope that by 2020 it will have grown to at least 10% of transport fuel. So, emissions drivers. So what's driving these trends in Ireland's transport emissions? Just in this graph here, I've just plotted transport emissions against GDP growth and against employment growth. I think that it's often, I think that people think that the correlation between transport emissions and economic growth is stronger than it actually is. As you can see, up to 2007, they were almost exactly aligned, GDP and transport emissions. However, from that point, we started to see the two paths diverging slightly, with the emissions line probably being more aligned with the employment line as opposed to the GDP line, which is interesting and points to sort of a few of the directions we might need to take in terms of policy around reducing emissions going forward. In this particular chart, I've just broken down Irish transport emissions between the various different component parts in terms of energy consumption in general. So as you can see, 55% of all transport emissions in Ireland are generated by the private car. It is less than its market share in terms of the number of vehicles, but still extraordinarily significant. You have heavy goods vehicles and light goods vehicles contributing in excess of 28%, which is also significant. So taking those two sectors into consideration, I mean, it clearly points to the way forward in tackling emissions is tackling emissions from both of those key sectors. I'll just flag here the 10% for fuel tourism. You might see as the slides as we move on a little bit of development in that particular thought. Fuel tourism is where people come across the border to buy fuel in Ireland and use it in another jurisdiction, namely Northern Ireland in our case, and that arises because of the price differential between fuels north and south of the border. But 10% of Irish transport emissions is a significant component of our overall transport emissions. Now, just breaking down the key economic indicators between private cars and freight, which are, as I said, the two key component parts of CO2 emissions in Ireland. So you have the emissions from cars in the red dotted line. You have cars under licence, which are continuing to increase there, and GDP, which has been sort of a little bit more up and down. As you can see, the car emissions, which had plotted along the line of GDP and cars under licence for a period of time, are now running underneath those, and that's primarily because of the improvements in efficiency that have been mandated at EU level and that we've supported in Ireland through our VRT and motor tax regimes. The little box on the right sets out the CO2 emissions from new cars. So their average emissions from new cars entering the fleet in each of those years, and you can see how the efficiency has dramatically improved, particularly since 2008. In terms of road freight, plotting freight emissions against GDP and construction employment is also quite instructive. We can see that freight emissions fell absolutely hugely following the end of our economic boom as we went into our downturn in 2007, 2008. And GDP didn't fall anywhere near as closely as that. So freight emissions are not following the same path as GDP, and there's something else going on in there. So having looked at a number of factors, I've just plotted their construction employment as most likely the largest component of that fall off in freight emissions. The elimination of construction vehicles off the road in Ireland post 2008 has been the strongest contributor to the reduction in freight emissions. Now, that presents us with a challenge, because as we know, construction is taking off again, so we're going to see all those construction vehicles back on our roads, and freight emissions are already starting to show that increase. So yeah, how does all of this information feed into the policy choices that we have to make? We can see, I suppose, we're trying to learn the lessons of the past, and from what we've seen of what happened in the past, and how that happened, to see whether or not there are things we did successfully during that time that we can replicate again. Emissions did decline between 2008 and 2012. A large proportion of that was down to emissions freight reduction. However, passenger car kilometres remained almost constant during the entire downturn, and passenger car emissions did fall, owing to two particular factors, we believe. One being the introduction of the biofuels obligation scheme, and the second being the improved energy efficiency of the car fleet, mandated again by the EU under emission standards, and then promoted in Ireland through the tax regime. When we look at how emissions have grown again since 2013, they've been back on an upward curve in transport. We can see that, in fact, the growth hasn't been as even as you might have expected to see, with it being entirely related to economic growth. In fact, the largest element of the growth there, almost a doubling, has been in fuel tourism. Now, as I outlined, we have taken some policy decisions. We haven't been wringing our hands. We recognise that meeting the climate challenge in transport is a very, very significant challenge. We have to act now. So a number of policy responses have been put in place. In 2008, as I said, we changed the VRT and motor tax regimes, and that contributed enormously to the take-up of the most efficient vehicles in vehicle manufacturers' fleets, leading to a 25% reduction in emissions from new passenger cars. In 2009, we introduced a carbon tax. In 2010, we introduced the biofuels obligation scheme, and currently 8% which is currently leading to a reduction of 8% per annum in emissions from transport fuel. 2011, we introduced the first set of electric vehicle supports. You might be aware that in budget 2018, we introduced a further set of EV supports, primarily arising out of the work of the Low Emitting Vehicles Task Force, and we might get a chance to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A session afterwards. In 2012, new CO2 emission standards came into being for cars, which have again improved the energy efficiency of cars, and 2014 vans were brought into that regime, which has led to an improvement in energy efficiency in vans. Now, this looks quite daunting as a slide, but in general, I'm just putting it up here just to point out all the various different approaches that we can take to reducing emissions in the transport sector. For the most part, the mobility measures, the public transport shifting to public transport, cycling, walking, are the ones we're deploying at the quickest pace at the moment. There are a range of issues arising in Irish transport policy, not just climate. Investment in public transport, investment in cycling and walking, and smarter travel in general meets so many of those objectives for us, and is also really significant in terms of ensuring that the demand growth that we expect to experience in transport over the next 20 years we can accommodate in the most emissions efficient way. We have a challenge in that the demand for transport is rising, and rising very steadily and quickly. We have increases in employment, we have increases in population. People need to travel as I said, for a range of reasons. So we have to try to ensure that travel is done in the most emissions efficient way as far as possible. We would like to see all of that additional transport demand absorbed in our public transport and in other sustainable modes. On the vehicle side, we're working in the Low Emitting Vehicles Task Force to try to ensure that we incentivise as early as possible the transition to alternative fuels and to better and more energy efficient vehicles. We're working, the various different local authorities are working on ensuring that we address congestion if we can at all, and the investment in public transport will also feed into that, but trying to ensure that our movements are not as constrained and therefore more emissions efficient. And we're also trying to ensure that where possible we're educating drivers as far as possible about the effects of driving in a more eco-efficient way and how that can both improve their bottom lines in terms of reducing fuel consumption and the cost of fuel, but also reducing their emissions output. I'm going to hand over to Dave now, who is going to talk to you about BusConnects. But just before I go, I think I'll leave you with this slide, which just compares the emissions efficiency of all the various different modes of transport. I think it's very, very clear that as far as possible, all of the additional transport demands that we envisage, we should be trying to meet in the most emissions efficient modes, which are public transport. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I haven't got anything funny to say now after your little introduction. I thought my boy band days were over, I suppose, and I wouldn't be the main acts and stuff like that, but thanks for letting me live my dream again. I was asked to talk about BusConnects, I suppose, and I'm going to focus in on that, and perhaps in the Q&A we may go off topic a little bit into other modes that we're looking at in terms of the NTA, in terms of actually hopefully helping with meeting our emissions targets. But I'll talk about the BusConnects programme. It's a programme works that we're working on the last while, National Transport Authority. Some of you may have seen a similar presentation. There is a little bit of an update from last year. We have a few plans, a few defined dates for some consultations this year, and also some, I suppose, possible tender packages that were going out for some people in the audience may be interested in that as well. So I'll kick off on that button there. So, no surprising, it's all over the news, whether we're getting blamed for Lewis Cross City opening, just in general, congestion is increasing. It has been increasing over the last number of years. Obviously, with the, as Laura says, there's more people travelling, there's more, the economy's picking up, and there's a lot of different metrics that's been measured around from data. For example, on average, 13% slower in 2016 than 2015, based on during the morning peak hour. I know some flows through the M50 has tripled in the last couple of years, and also even journey times on particular routes have increased phenomenally as well. Obviously, in the NTA, we have long-term strategies. We have a strategy adopted what's called 2030 Vision, which goes out to 2035. And we've set out, based on predicted growth in population, employment, we've put together a sort of overall strategy of what we see, and hopefully try to carry as many people as possible by sustainable modes and public transport. In the short term, though, what's the solution? It has to be bus-based. Dublin's a low-density city, so because of that, the bus system already forms the backbone of the transport system overall, and it's the only way that we can do it. BusConnects, we hope to actually transform the whole bus system. I'm going to talk about the different components, but obviously what we want to do, I don't particularly like the word used that we have here in the slide, fast. We want to be competitive more so for private car, but also we want to be reliable, punctual and convenient. They're the key ingredients for any sort of shift that we can hope to achieve against people who actually continue to use the private car. Again, it's not just, as Laura pointed out, people who travel to work. We want to actually to make bus and public transport and sustainable modes, a viable and attractive choice for all trips, for students, shoppers and visitors, etc. So what is it? We're looking at doing a lot of investment in a network of what we call next generation bus corridors. There'll be complete redesign of the bus network, state-of-the-art ticketing system, fare structure. Linked into that is obviously there's a lot of movement in this field in terms of account-based ticketing using credit cards. Technology is moving at pace across here. Looking at bus-based park and rides, it's quite common as you know on both the Lewis and the heavy rail network. On top of that, we want to actually, because we're doing such a transformation, we're looking at new bus livery. This is also linked into the fact that we're opening up a portion of the market away from, say, there could be, say, go ahead of 110% for Dublin Bus for the Dublin region. So we're looking at that. Bus stops and shelters. Also now we'll have more operators. There's also the information. What would you expect? Actually, if you're a passenger, how legible is this and what information you have at them? And indeed, linked into what we're talking about there, low emission vehicles and looking at moving away from the standard diesel bus, which is if not the vast majority of, I suppose, the propulsion system used for the bus vehicles currently. So what do we mean by next generation bus corridors? Here's where if you had a key eye in previous presentations of this, there used to be a thing in between core bus network, there was bus rapid transit. And we defined previously in Dublin what we thought bus rapid transit was. And if you look at that and what we're talking about next generation bus corridors, it's practically the exact same thing, except in terms of what we were considering for the vehicle at that stage. At the moment, or currently I should say, and it hasn't changed too much overall, the journey times are getting longer along all the bus corridors. And that's because they're sharing a lot of their space with general traffic. Typically, there's only 1/3 of their length, and it's typically in one direction only, have bus lanes. And sometimes peak journey times can take twice as long as off-peak. So if we invest in infrastructure, we should be able to actually achieve the off-peak journey times throughout the day. And that's what we're looking at the next generation bus corridor. So these are the ones that we've looked at. So it goes the full circumference of Dublin, from Swords and Clongriffin on the north side, all the way around by Blanchardstown, Lucan, and Tala, Rathfarnham to Bray. So they're the radial core bus network. That's traditional. We are actually currently, the bus network is very radially orientated. If you want to go from, say, Lucan to Rathfarnham, you have to go all the way into town to come back out. So also what we're looking at is actually now putting in more investment into what we call the orbital bus corridors. And we've identified 3. So there's 2 orbital routes that we're looking at between the M50 and, I suppose, the Canal Cordon, and then one on just outside the M50. So the purpose of these there is actually now that people, rather than having to go all the way into the city centre, will be able to move between some of the radial routes if they have a journey that's not in the city centre by using some of these orbital routes. The reason why we're spending a lot of time and money, and hopefully in the capital plan that'll be announced in the coming weeks, I know there's different dates, but I'm not too sure how it'll happen. We're hoping to actually secure a lot of funding for BusConnects, and overall it'll be in excess of €1 billion required to actually deliver every part of it. A lot of it is going to be involved in the bus infrastructure. We want to remove the current delays and uncertainties, and to do that we need to get space. It'll require widening the roads. It might make changes to parking arrangements and loading in the city centre. It may also encroach into property, public or private. But overall, we're trying to benefit the whole use of the corridor. In addition, we're going to actually overlap and introduce, they're going to be multimodal corridors. We want to actually make the actual cross-section be much more efficient in what it can carry through. So we're going to be investing a lot in terms of cycling, infrastructure, segregated along these routes, additional footpath space where we have it, and also more defined pedestrian crossings. And also car users will have reduced interaction with cyclists and buses, and will, because we're investing a lot across the roads, we're going to be doing infrastructure interventions, they'll probably get a nice resurfaced roadway as part of it. It may not be enough to keep them all happy, but sure, we'll see. Ideally, that'd be what a typical road layout would look at. And all of you in this room will know there's not many roads that are that wide in Dublin to actually fit that as easily as that. So there will be a few challenges overall. But ideally, what you'd like is to have that type of configuration there. Bus network redesign. There's a lot of work ongoing at the moment. There was consultation. We have an international consultant came aboard to do a lot of work with ourselves and the bus operators on how to redesign the bus network. There was a number of workshops, choices paper, and there was consultations on it. So, as I said, currently there's over 130 routes on the current bus system. It's quite complex, very regularly focused, and limited orbital connections within it. Most people know a wedge or a snippet of the bus network to make their own journey time, etc., their own journey to and from certain places. It's mainly focused, and a lot of things in Ireland is focused on actually A to B, and you like to get on the bus and get off another one there. So we are going to have to focus a little bit more on the interchange. Most European cities, you travel around, it's seamless through interchange, etc. So we're going to have to win the hearts and minds of people with that as well. But all we want to do is try to make the system more efficient and carry more passengers to more places at the same cost as the current systems. In terms of this, we hope to actually go into consultation, the final consultation on the preferred network in June 2018. I should have said on the infrastructure side, we are going to go out with that core network for consultation towards the end of April 2018. We've done a lot of work on those core networks actually in terms of a number of concept designs, and some of the people who've worked on them are in the audience. And we are going to be going out for quite large tender packages for engineers, designers, an engineering design package. So we're going to actually divide those 16 radial routes into sort of, I suppose, lots of a number of corridors to actually bring it through, I suppose, what we call preliminary design and the statutory approval process. And we'll be hopefully issuing tender documentation in the coming weeks for that. Here's a typical example that's been used by the international consultant, just showing the type of what has been done in New Zealand. So that's the map of the frequent bus routes before the redesigned network, and this is what it looked like afterwards. And this was done without any increase in operating budgets. So they actually came up with high frequency spine routes, coupled with actually more feeders and interchanges in places, but actually having much better frequency. So the end-to-end journey times, including interchange and stuff like that, was actually much more efficient overall. And also the timetable, the standardisation of services was much better through that. Obviously, for us to achieve that, it's not just the infrastructure that has to change. The second, I suppose, largest delay in terms of journey time is actually dwell times and stops, and actually the interaction with the drivers. Even with Leap Card, there's still a lot of interaction with the driver for routes that aren't going end to end. You might have electronic ports on your Leap Card, but there's still a lot of interaction with the driver. And this can add several minutes on a typical journey, even if you have a fair speed on moving along through it. This is one thing, I suppose, on my background work on the Lewis, etc. The key ingredients that Lewis has, it has a constant, I suppose, dwell time of stops. It's in around 25 seconds. Doors open, off-board ticketing, in and out. So we are looking at actually, can we replicate some of this in terms of, I suppose, the fare structure and also the technology. We'll probably try to move to tag on, tag off, so you don't have to have as much interaction. Also, when I get around to the vehicles, it may actually move in terms of vehicles, not just propulsion choice. We might actually look at better use of doors, a third door perhaps on a double-deck vehicle. We don't know. We're looking at some of them as well. Because if you remove some of this uncertainty at the stops, you actually have much more certainty throughout, and you can actually headway management overall. Also, in terms of that as well, the integrated ticketing is great in your pockets. It works out well. We have to move more from just an integrated ticket in terms of an integrated fare. You can't actually be penalised financially if you're actually moving between modes. So that's what we want to move overall as well. A lot of work going through that. And also, in terms of that technology is evolving over time, and some of the parts of the leap, while not obsolete yet, it is actually starting to move into obsolescence. We are going to have to invest a lot into actually keeping abreast with the next generation ticketing system. Bus livery, I suppose we did go out, so we want to actually have a new, fresh and modern look. With the market opening, we want to actually get it into sort of an overall public transport brand, Transport for Ireland, and we're looking at livery for the, I suppose, the painted exterior of the buses. Overall, we went out and we're working through a lot of people's views on the potential designs we went out, and we hope to make a final decision very, very soon, because I have another number of buses on order, and they really want to paint them because they really want me to pay them, and I won't pay them until they're finished. But anyway, we'll argue about that for another few weeks overall, but we'll be fine. Bus stops. There's now an expectation with bus stops overall. Some stops don't justify real-time passenger information, but we will want to roll that out. But in terms of the ones that don't have real-time passenger information, we have to move away from just actually having a copy of the timetable on it. We want to get more detail on the bus, the routes, etc. But we want to actually get more specific timetables per that stop. So even the paper or the hard copies, they'll actually have timetable information to stop and be specific to that stop, then rather than one, there's a bus has left town at 6 o'clock this evening and you've no idea at 6:20 has it come, gone, or etc. So we want to actually have a bit more certainty and information that stops. Also for people who aren't familiar with the system, I'd say it's quite daunting if you're not familiar with the system, how to actually move around it as well. So there's a lot of information. We want to really roll out that. So we really want to quality that. Also bus shelters, we want them to actually be comfortable if people are waiting, particularly if there is interchange, regardless how seamless it is. So we want to improve that overall. Also, and it hasn't been attracted before, the thoughts of bus-based parking ride, particularly because you were getting out of your car prior to getting congestion and you're going into a sort of mode that was and probably still is currently quite unreliable. It wasn't as attractive. With the Lewis, as I said, because of the level of segregation that has, you can actually is much more punctual, reliable, etc. So rail-based park and ride works quite well as a component of your journey to and from work. Obviously, there's still some portion of your transport still is by car, but at least in terms of congestion and moving people through the city centre, it's actually better and it has other benefits besides congestion, air quality, etc. So we're looking at that there, and we've identified a number of ones for some of the bus routes as well. Low emission vehicles. This is a part of, I suppose, the work that we're currently undertaking at the moment, particularly with the targets that we have set overall, how to achieve it. Obviously, the biggest way public transport can actually help reduce emissions is actually through modal split, get more people onto it. But that's not going to be enough now. We have to start moving into, I suppose, low emission vehicles. Within that, I suppose, over time, there has been a lot of work done on engines, etc., to actually improve some of the engine outputs and the Euro standards. But on top of that, we have to go further again. We have to actually move away from diesel. It's a fossil fuel. Obviously, it doesn't have much of a life left overall. There's a lot of, I suppose, what would you say, research going into particularly different kinds of electromobility. The different types of electromobility has fluctuated over times. From we go full hybrid now, we go pure full electric there. Some that were in the infancy, we're looking at fuel cells. Then we have the mature technology. We have compressed natural gas, which obviously has its benefits as well. It's utilised everywhere. And now we actually even have the opportunity with compressed natural gas to actually have a look at biogas and actually introducing that into the market. So what we are doing in NTA, say in the Dublin region, we have approximately 1,000 buses. So by 2023, we want to have approximately 500 buses. converted to low emission vehicles and fully complete by 2030. To do that, we're going to identify our preferred technology, or possibly two technologies, because we're getting down to that type of level, and how we actually appraise them is quite difficult. We've talked to Laura and her team on this as well. To start actually going out to tender for these vehicles. Some of them have other costs associated with them, in addition to just the actual capital cost of the vehicles. So we're looking at that. But we are going to actually transition across, and the best way to actually do bus replacement is steady state replacement, because they still only have a whole life of roughly, say, 12 years. So you want to replace them on an average. So to get 500 buses by 2023, we typically try to buy in around 100 buses a year. Dublin Bus would want more, obviously, than that. So we do have to start fairly quickly, get some orders in this year, and then start to rolling out, hopefully, only low emission vehicles. Any order after, I suppose, mid-2019 is the plan. Ambitious enough, but we're going to give it a go. So, just to wrap up BusConnects in general, we're hoping it will provide a real choice for thousands of people, as opposed to just trying to push them on, the same, relying on people to actually make the choice on their own. We think actually by making it more competitive, getting the reliability of bus journey, obviously the people who already are using the network already will feel the benefits, but also hopefully we'll attract a lot more into it. We feel, based on what we know about journey bus times currently, that we could reduce them by about a third or more, the journey time, but more importantly, to be reliable, and you can plan your journey much more, your end-to-end journey with much more confidence about it. The redesigned network will connect more people to more places, and more places to people, so there should be some good synergies there for different people, better access to possibly educational institutions, hospitals, workplaces that weren't as readily accessible. And also the opposite of that is actually the employers will have actually better access to areas where people, they may want people to come from. BusConnects is slightly different to some other schemes that we have on the go at the moment. It will deliver across the whole region. It's not just focused on one corridor. Obviously, on certain other corridors, we are doing a lot of work in the NTA in terms of, I suppose, some of the higher density corridors. We're looking obviously at Metro. We're looking at a lot of work in terms of the rail network. As part of that, hopefully in the capital plan, there will be some funding for progressing some of them. Just in terms of the rail network, obviously Metros and Lewis are already electric vehicles. We're hoping to actually then try to expand the DART network and get more electric or even hybrid vehicles onto the DART network. It also delivers a lot in terms of, I suppose, multimodal corridors. We see cycling as being key, and it's one of the best ways to actually deliver the cycling infrastructure and altogether to do full corridor work. And hopefully we'll have a modern, efficient, effective bus system providing world-class public transport, bus transport service. Just to reiterate what we're doing, the next steps. So, next generation bus corridors, we're going out for consultation of that network there in April 2018. We're just pulling together all the drawings. As I said, it's going to be quite difficult in some places to squeeze them in and out and around. Some locations, it's not going to be as easy in terms of routings for car. There's going to be some property take. And so we'll see how we go. But these are the type of things you have to do to actually, if you want to actually achieve some of this reliability going forward. In June 2018, we'll have the bus network redesign, which actually will hopefully overlay the service in line with some of the infrastructure that we're putting in. Just in terms of the planning process and the guidance, the planning process for the infrastructure, the bus corridors, will likely require on board panel approval. So there's going to be a lot of work done in terms of actually preparing for that. That's why I'm saying there's going to be a lot of design. There's going to have to be a business case. There's a lot of interactions there, and we're working through this at the moment. As I said, hopefully choose the alternative fuel or fuels and start going out to tender for low emission bus vehicles later this year. We might trial or do pilots in some locations because we have some new routes that are coming board, certain things we're going to look at there. And then we're in the process, and this is actually, the rollout of new bus stops, even though it seems quite small, it's one of the hardest things that I have to manage at the moment. Some of the stuff, the big stuff, will look after themselves, but working out the best way to actually deliver a pole on the ground with a socket and a cubic metre of concrete is proven quite challenging overall, and then actually printing that. And I've tried to explain that to some of my colleagues that are more involved in some of the actual bus market opening, that I can't get so many poles and flags painted in one day for your big switch over between one bus operator and the next. But I'll worry about that in August and not tonight. But I thought I'd feel better if I unburdened a little bit just now. Thank you very much. I can go 25 to. Okay. I sort of have to leave at 25 to, because that BusConnects and that wonderful bus network hasn't materialised yet. And all I know is my one bus that goes to Blessington goes round past Rathmines about 8:05, and seemingly it's 27 minutes from here. No offer a crossbar on a bike. Nothing. No.
Stay where you are. Guys, thanks a million for excellent presentations. Just to say as well, anybody on the webcast, you can email your questions through to engineerswebcast@gmail.com. For any questions we have an iPad here, we can pick them up. So, listen, any questions? I suppose we can hand out to the audience.
Thanks very much Thanks very much for the two presentations. I have a couple of quick questions. One is about the overall cost of the scheme, which has been touted to be between 750 and €1 billion. What is the bulk of that cost attributable to? Is it to the new buses, is it to the planning process, CPOs? What is that going to provide? And secondly, what is the status of the Swiftway or the bus rapid transit scheme that's previously brought close to the planning process? Is that now subsumed into this, or has it experienced difficulties that may be replicated by the bus?
Okay. You don't want to take them, do you? Okay, in terms of, as I said, it's don't mean the total BusConnects don't mean in excess of it, 1 billion. Okay, the vast majority of that will be on the bus corridors. Okay, there will be, like, if you look at the length of the bus network there, most of them 10-15 kilometres in length. Estimation, you're probably in around 5 million per kilometre minimum. On top of that, there will be, as part of this, an overhaul or just trying to monitor. It's don't get caught up. We can't have a separate pot for just bus replacement overall. We will spend, typically, by about 150 buses a year. There's probably 70 million we spend, if we can, on buses each year, just to replace and try to expand the network. So the two biggest ones will be on the actual infrastructure, and then obviously on the bus, on both of them in total, trying to roll them out. It's going to be difficult to actually put a time frame on how quickly we can roll out each corridor. We can't do them all at the same time, otherwise the congestion that we see now is nothing compared to what it will be if we're trying to rip up every road and every crossing of Dublin. So the vast majority will be on the infrastructure. There will be some property costs. We're trying to actually obviously try to minimise that. We're trying to, if there is property costs, we'll obviously try not to actually, particularly residential, if there's residential, any, I suppose, habitable, with people living there, we're trying not to go into that level of extent. We're not putting in whole new roads or anything. But there will be some, I suppose, encroachment in gardens or into other property boundaries. So there will be a CPO process part of it as well. We haven't got a full estimation on that. We have concept designs of a reasonable level of detail that we have produced, and they'll be included in our public consultation document. We plan to have an overarching one, and then if there is any people with property, potential property impacts, we will be contacting them before to start the consultation. The second one was, I suppose, was the BRT, And the Swiftway, I suppose, I spent a number of years on that. I started back looking at the BRT. First of all, was when I was in my role in RPA. BRT came in the side, why are we building metros when you can carry the same amount on a BRT? And then you realise that BRT can be there's a whole spectrum of what BRT is, and we came up with, I suppose, a core BRT network. And a lot of that was, at the time, it was a step change in the bus network. We were looking at having separate services. We were looking at actually having what we called a semi-open system, where the BRT vehicles would be the predominant routes on it, and the existing bus network would feed into it. In terms of infrastructure, it wouldn't be too dissimilar to what we're talking about here. We were looking at a bit more the European systems where they actually have single deck articulated vehicles, because you have multiple doors, and actually looking for the sort of Lewis type off-board fare collection. But some of the stuff now that we're looking at on these corridors here, besides the vehicles, is not too dissimilar in terms of the level of quality and segregation we're looking for. So it's sort of been subsumed into this. And in terms of the different corridors, Blanchardstown to UCD was one of them, Swords to the city centre, and Clongriffin to Tala have been captured in this part here. We've actually done a lot on the Swords. When we went, we had all the planning documentation and EIS produced, etc. But what happened there was actually a move, or a bit of move was in terms of Metro North. And we had to actually see which way Metro and that scheme actually interacted overall. So that's where they're at the moment. Is that okay?
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, Billy Fleming is my name. I'm attached to Dublin Bus Training School in Fitzroy, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Dublin Bus here. I'm a private individual.
Okay.
Just to get back to the business of alternative fuel vehicles, because the two things are tied in, BusConnects and the vehicles you're going to use on it are linked very strongly. We hear a lot, you mentioned earlier on, about having to get onto your vehicle suppliers, about having new vehicles painted and all that. Has there been any studies done on retrofitting, re-engineing, repowering existing vehicles? The reason I mention is we've 980 odd vehicles in the fleet.
I can still hear you. Yeah.
Oh, that's all right. And there would appear to me to be quite a financial gain to be gained from re-engineering, repowering with hybrid technology, new hybrid technology into existing low-floor chassis. I'm just wondering, has the NTA looked at that, or is it prepared to look at it, or are we going down the shiny new route all the time?
Okay.
One other question I also have to ask is, you mentioned your difficulties with bus stop positioning and bus stop infrastructure, and it's more than just about the pole in the ground. I see you learned that very quickly. The standards for bus stop construction that the Department of Transport produce mention things like a 37 metre ideal sweep in and sweep out for buses. You'll travel far and wide in the city before you'll find that, and it has one of the major effects on bus stop dwell times. Just simply getting in and out of the stop, never mind the actual loading process. So I'm just wondering, it's a two-pronged question, one about the repowering, or what we're doing to investigate that, if anything, and the other about the bus stop infrastructure and the need to actually segregate space and use it specifically for buses.
Okay.
That's all.
Perfect. I'll take both of them. You may want to come in just a little bit add a little bit on the engine stuff. Just taking the bus stops, you're 100% correct. There's more than just a pole or shelter in the ground. One thing we are trying to do on these bus corridors is actually we're having inline stops. We're not looking to have any pull-ins. We're looking to actually keep it all in line. We're obviously trying to look at straights, etc. So that's something that we're trying to look at overall. I know in certain locations, drivers and the rights, and sometimes you can't get back out when you go in, and when you get back out, sometimes people have put in wonderful bollards and stuff like that. They're not manoeuvrable, and I suppose the intro of the buses and stuff like that, etc., can be interfered with. So we are looking at that all the time. I have noticed by moving poles and flags down in Cork, I get some very interesting emails that, oh no, you can't put that bus stop back, even though the bus, when it pulls in, is actually blocking the whole junction. So I just moved up further, but that person in that house knows better political representative than the people down below. So we deal with those ones all the time as well. In terms of, I suppose, the retrofit, I suppose I work a lot with your colleagues in Dublin Bus, the chief mechanical engineer, and we've got on that. And in fairness, we're trying to steady state is 80 buses per year. He'd like to take out of the older ones and move into. All the buses since 2016 are Euro 6 vehicles, so they're quite clean. It was a big step change from the Euro 5. So I think when we get through this tranche, a lot of the older ones are gone. But I think with some of the difficulties, they're holding on to more. So I have asked them to have a look at what their view is, because will we get much benefit out of it? And I know Laura has a separate fund, which I haven't mentioned this evening, that could be utilised for some of this as well, rather than just bridging the gap. We're not too sure of the full merits, but we are exploring it on my point anyway, with my discussions.
Yeah, just on that point, the climate change unit in the Department of Transport is with our public transport colleagues sort of reviewing public transport policy in general, and one of the things that we're working on at the moment is a paper on the most cost-effective and emissions-efficient mechanisms by which to transition to alternative fuels within the public bus fleets in general. Not just Dublin Bus, across Ireland. There are a range of different bus types in use across Ireland. So you have urban buses in Dublin Bus, you have urban buses in the other cities, and you have different types of urban buses in those cities, and then you have sort of stage bus services up and down the country. So there's a good deal of work and a good deal of research being undertaken in the department and looking at an economic assessment of the best way of it affecting the transition to zero emission capable ultimately, and the various transitions that will be required to do that. At the moment, in terms of very preliminary assessments, it is looking like the most cost-effective way is taking out the least efficient buses and replacing them with the newest, most efficient buses in the regular replacement rate, rather than spending a lot of money on retrofitting older buses that are going to be taken out of the fleet. We hope within the next 5 years. So as I say, that is all sort of being considered, and an economic assessment is underway within the department, and we're working with the NTA on that, and we'll be giving them all of the benefit of that research that we've been undertaking. On air quality, though, and air quality is not something we've discussed this evening at all. Unfortunately, our time is very constrained, and I focused my presentation just on climate issues. But there are some very potentially significant retrofitting solutions for urban bus fleets in particular, in order just to trap the particularly noxious tailpipe emissions for air quality reasons. So there is, and we hope to we've made a submission to the EPA for some research funding to run a pilot on retrofitting for air quality purposes of the urban bus fleets, which may be a more cost-effective way than retrofitting hybrid.
Hello, Jerry Duggan, Irish Academy of Engineering, former director of Irish Rail and Bus-Éireann, and the person responsible for the original configuration of the Lewis network in Dublin. Just a few comments. One in relation to Laura's presentation. It might be better if we use GNI star in terms of looking at the economic variable in terms of what's happening here, rather than using leprechaun economics, which is GNP. I know it's the international standard, but frankly it is no...
Back to 1990, unfortunately.
I know,
so, yeah.
but it has no relevance in the Irish situation in reality. The second point is, in terms of the emissions, the transport emissions in the early 1990s are understated, in that we had a significant level of inward fuel tourism at that stage because of the price differential between the UK and Ireland. Now the level of transport emissions, or the level of fuel tourism, is understated because there's about 500,000 tonnes of emissions associated with truckers filling up in Ireland and crossing over to the UK that is not properly accounted for in the system. So, there's about nearly 2 million tonnes of CO2 emissions that we could take out of the transport emissions if we changed the fuel prices.
Could I just answer that particular one? The transport emissions are calculated on fuel sales in Ireland. So all the fuel sold in Ireland contribute to the
I appreciate that. All I'm saying is the actual level of emissions in Ireland are overstated because you have the hauliers.
Oh, completely.
Yeah. And now what we're saying is
admit that much at
no,
all, yeah.
there's about 2 million tonnes that could be taken out if the fuel prices were changed. I know the Department of Finance have a view about that.
Everyone in Ireland would have a view about the level of increase in transport costs that would entail.
Going to the presentation in relation to BusConnect, etc., I think probably the most useful contribution that has been made by the NTA in this area has been the provision of real-time information at bus stops. It has absolutely changed people's perception of how to take a bus. However, I would say that the graphics produced there for the bus system in Dublin don't take adequate account of the fact that the Wide Streets Commission provided excellent east-west corridors in Ireland, or in Dublin, should I say. There is no north-south high-capacity road corridor, nor is one likely to be ever constructed. That absolutely limits the capacity of the bus system in Dublin. And the introduction of Lewis Cross City, which was decided against 20 years ago because of the exact issues that have arisen in College Green, i.e. that we have probably lost public transport capacity by its introduction. You know, that was predictable. It has happened. And I think we need to recognise that Dublin's north-south road transport capacity is extremely limited, and therefore we have to plan on that basis. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I do. Does anyone have a quick one before I run? Bear RTBI is the apps on the phone, so it's going to tell me that I'm behind schedule all the way to the bus stop in a minute. I didn't plan to jog.
I know, David, you're stuck for time there, so there was a couple of questions came in actually for both yourself and Laura.
Was I available for 24th and that type of stuff
No.
for singing? No.
No, unfortunately not. There was just one that you've answered already, Laura, on fuel tourism. There was a couple of questions there around whether emissions are counted where the fuel is purchased or where the fuel is used, and people were querying that and how sensible that was, and maybe there's something in a policy perspective that can be done on that.
There's a whole stream of UN work on precisely that, and lots of international negotiation, but there's a set of international criteria and set by the UN which we have to follow.
And then there was a question there on just a comment really on the radial bus routes the orbital bus routes connecting with the radial bus routes. Have you considered use of rental bike schemes to effectively link the radial bus routes with the orbital ones? I know you don't have time to answer that.
Yeah, well no, in fairness, we do start looking at that type of stuff overall, and we're even looking, there's a lot more than just the standard rent bike, there's stopless bike and stuff like that. So we do want to look at interchange, but again, sometimes that's extra space, and some of you have to make sure you have them all actually stocked and stuff like that. But I can come back to that at another stage.
As well as park and ride for cars, park and ride for bikes.
Yeah, I know, cycle
The
ride. And in fairness, another thing, if it works out, there may be locations where you might want to do a sort of what we call the kiss and ride or drop off facilities as well.
Thanks, David. Just maybe last comment. Don't paint the buses Dublin blue anyway, please. You know.
Oh, just I want to say, BusConnects will be going national, so we'll have red buses at some stage. Thanks very much, folks.